Chapter 1. Blank Paper and Rat Friend. My grandfather's name was Huguowa. The Hu family was a well-known landowner in the region, owning more than 40 connected houses along 3 alleys in the city. During its most prosperous period, the family had produced a few officials and merchants and had even contributed financially to the Qing dynasty's grain stations and river transportation offices. As the saying goes, wealth does not last beyond 3 generations. This is indeed true, even with mountains of wealth. It cannot withstand the squandering of wasteful descendants. By the time of the Republic of China, when it reached my grandfather's generation, the family's fortune began to decline. The family assets were divided, and Huguowa received a considerable share, enough for a comfortable life. However, he was unwilling to live properly, influenced partly by the social environment of that time. He first became addicted to gambling, then opium, eventually squandering the entire family fortune. In his youth, Huguowa indulged in every vice: drinking, gambling, and womanizing. In the end, he was so poor that he didn't have a penny to his name. When the craving for opium struck, he was in unbearable torment. But without money, who would let him smoke? In his affluent days, the opium den owners and workers treated him with utmost respect, calling him Master Hu. But as soon as he was penniless, they saw him as a nuisance and drove him away like a beggar. When a person is driven mad by poverty, concepts like shame and morality become insignificant. Huguowa devised a plan to deceive his uncle for some money. His uncle knew Hu was a wastrel and an opium addict and would not normally give him a cent. But this time, Hu lied, saying he needed money to get married, hoping his uncle would help. On hearing this, his uncle was moved to tears. This unworthy nephew was finally doing something right. He thought that perhaps with a virtuous wife to guide him, Hu might change his ways in the future. So, his uncle gave him 20 silver dollars and advised him to marry a good wife and live an honest life, urging him not to touch opium again. His uncle even planned to visit Huguowa's home soon to meet the new wife. Huguowa, ever full of tricks, went back home and found a craftsman in the village skilled at making paper effigies, the kind usually burned as offerings for the dead. This craftsman was very skilled and could make anything described to him with lifelike accuracy. Following Hu's request, the craftsman made a woman out of white paper, adding watercolor paint to give her eyes, eyebrows, nose, clothing, and hair. From a distance, she looked almost like a real person. Hu carried the paper woman home, placed her on the bed in the inner room, and covered her with a quilt. He thought he had it all planned out. When his uncle came, he would say that his wife was ill and unable to receive visitors. allowing his uncle to only glance at her from afar. Feeling smug, he hummed a tune and headed into town to smoke opium. A few days later, his uncle visited, bringing gifts like floral cloth and pastries for the new bride. Hu Guo was stuck to his prepared story, claiming his wife wasn't feeling well and couldn't see visitors. He let his uncle lift the door curtain for a quick glance before pulling it back down. However, his uncle wasn't satisfied. "Oh, so you're going to brush off your own uncle like this? No way. I must see the new bride today. If she's ill, I'll pay for a doctor to treat her." Who tried everything to prevent the meeting, but his resistance only made his uncle more suspicious, leading to an argument. Just then, the inner room's curtain lifted, and out stepped a woman, fair-skinned with a broad face, wide hips, and small feet, whose heart skipped a beat. It was the paper effigy he had commissioned. But how was it alive? The woman respectfully greeted the uncle, explaining that she hadn't felt well and apologized for not welcoming him sooner. She added that she suddenly felt better and invited him to stay for a meal, then turned and went back to the kitchen to cook. Hu Guohua's uncle was overjoyed. The niece-in-law was not only virtuous, but also looked like she'd bring prosperity to the family. He thought that if his deceased sister could see her son marry such a good wife, she would surely be pleased. In his happiness, the uncle gave Hu another 10 silver dollars, who stood there, dumbfounded and panicked, unsure whether to feel lucky or terrified. Time passed quickly, and evening arrived. The paper woman prepared a whole table of dishes, and his uncle was delighted beyond measure. However, who had no appetite. Watching the woman sitting across from him, he felt a wave of disgust, as though he had swallowed a fly. Her face was deathly pale, with all the color merely painted on with rouge. His uncle, with his dim eyesight, didn't notice anything unusual about the woman. After downing 7 or 8 cups of rice wine, he became thoroughly drunk, who borrowed a donkey cart to take him home. On his way back, the more Hu thought about it, the more frightened he became. So he decided not to return home and spent the night in the city's pleasure district, where he squandered the 10 silver dollars his uncle had just given him on opium and other indulgences. Eventually, he ran out of money and was thrown out for being unable to pay his bill. With nowhere else to go, he reluctantly returned home. Upon arrival, he found the house dark, with the paper woman lying motionless on his bed, covered with a quilt, as if nothing had ever happened. Thinking that if he kept her, she might come to life again at night, Hu decided to burn the paper effigy to be rid of it. He carried her to the yard, took out a lighter, and was about to set her aflame when the paper woman suddenly spoke.
"You heartless man. I helped you with good intentions, And yet you want to burn me.
Who was startled. And in the dead of night, he heard the paper woman continue.
I pitied you. Though you indulge in all sorts of vices, you're not entirely heartless. I want to marry you. Will you agree?
Huguo shook his head vigorously and asked the paper woman, "Are you a demon or a ghost?" The paper woman replied,
Of course I am a ghost, temporarily possessing this paper body. But don't look down on me, you poor soul. In life, I was very wealthy, and my burial treasures could provide you with opium for 10 lifetimes. Haven't you heard that a rich ghost is 100 times better than a poor living man?
Mention of wealth piqued Huguo's interest, as he was extremely poor, having pawned even his clothes. However, he was wary of the risk of obtaining money but losing his life in the process. He had heard stories from elders about malevolent female ghosts who seduced men, draining them of their vitality. Those who fell prey to such spirits were said to waste away until they were nothing more than skin and bones. So he told the paper woman, "Even if your intentions are sincere, I cannot marry you. We belong to different worlds. The living and the dead are separated by the bounds of nature. Such an action would defy heaven's order." The paper woman responded,
Since you are so heartless, I won't force you. But remember, one day you will regret this. If you ever reach a point where you are destitute, come to the desolate graveyard at Shirsani-Pu. In the center of that graveyard, there is a lone grave with no tombstone. My body lies within that coffin, along with gold and jewels. If you dare to come, you may take those treasures as you please.
With that, the paper woman fell silent and motionless. Gathering his courage, Huguo set her ablaze, reducing the paper effigy to ashes. Later, on several occasions, Hu found himself so desperate that he considered going to Shirsani-Pu to dig up the grave. But each time, he restrained himself, scraping by through loans and whatever means he could manage. 2 years later, with no options left, he finally went to that graveyard, but that's a story for another time. That year's spring festival brought many incidents. Whose scheme of creating a paper effigy to deceive his uncle was eventually exposed. Enraged and deeply upset, his uncle fell ill and passed away within 3 days. Whose relatives and friends treated him as though he were a thief. Not only would they refuse him money, but they wouldn't even let him have a bite of their leftovers. Huguo sold his last family heirloom, a pair of rosewood boxes, part of his mother's dowry, for $2 silver. He had always wanted to keep them for sentimental value, but couldn't resist when his opium craving hit. He used the money to buy a small piece of opium and rushed home. eagerly lighting his pipe and sinking onto the bed. After 2 deep inhalations, he felt light as though floating on a cloud. At that moment, he felt as happy as a deity, and all the daily scorn, insults, and mistreatment he endured seemed trivial. Taking 2 more puffs, he noticed a dark figure on his bed. Looking closely, he saw an old rat, its whiskers white with age and nearly the size of a cat, perched in the corner of his bed. The rat was greedily sniffing the opium smoke wafting from whose pipe, seeming to enjoy the opium's effects. Amused, Ugolwa said to the rat, "So you also have an addiction to opium? Looks like we're kindred spirits." He took another puff and blew the smoke towards the rat. The rat, sensing no harm, raised its head to inhale the smoke. After a while, appearing satisfied, it slowly crawled away. For the next few days, the old rat returned each day to smoke with Hu, shunned and despised by everyone around him, with not a single friend, who grew fond of the rat, feeling a sense of camaraderie. Sometimes, when the rat arrived late, who would even hold off smoking, waiting for its company. But the good times didn't last. Whose home was now empty, with only a bed and 4 bare walls remaining. He had no money left to buy opium. In despair, he sighed and spoke to the rat. "Oh dear rat, I am penniless today and have no more money to buy opium. I fear I won't be able to share this pleasure with you anymore." He sighed deeply after speaking. Hearing his words, the rat's eyes gleamed thoughtfully, and it turned to leave. That evening, the rat returned, carrying a silver coin, which it placed by Hu's pillow. Overjoyed, Hu rushed to town that very night to buy a piece of opium. Upon returning, he lit it under the lamp and indulged, smoking contentedly with the rat by his side. The next day, the rat brought him 3 more silver coins. Hu was so delighted he was at a loss for words. Recalling a classic tale he'd learned at school, he said to the rat, as Bao Shui knew and supported Guanzhong, "You know my poverty and have been so generous to me. You are truly my friend. Let us become sworn brothers if you don't mind." From then on, he called the rat Brother Rat, and they shared food, opium, and even made a small bed out of cotton for the rat to sleep beside him. Man and rat lived together in perfect harmony, as close as lifelong friends. Each day, the rat would bring back silver coins, sometimes 1 or 2, sometimes as many as 3 or 5, allowing Hu to live in comfort and abundance. Many years later, my grandfather would often reminisce, saying those days were the happiest of his life. After more than half a year of this lifestyle, Ugolwa gradually became wealthier. But as the saying goes, fortune brings friends, and misfortune attracts scoundrels. It was Hu's fate to be unlucky and soon enough, he caught the eye of a troublemaker. In the village, there was a rascal named Wang or Ganger. Unlike Guohua, who had at least been wealthy once and had been called young master who for over 20 years, Wang or Ganger hadn't been as fortunate. His family, for 8 generations, had never worn a pair of pants that wasn't worn through. When he saw Guohua's downfall, he took delight in it, constantly taunting and insulting him, bullying the once wealthy young master who helped him feel better about himself. Recently, Wang found something strange. Guohua, this poor wretch with nothing left to pawn and hardly any living relatives, somehow had money to smoke opium every day. Where did he get the money for opium? Maybe he turned to thievery. Wang decided to watch him in secret and catch him red-handed, planning to turn him over to the authorities for a reward. After a while, Wang observed that Hu only left the house occasionally to buy some food and opium, and otherwise stayed home, interacting with no one. The less he understood where Hu's money came from, the more curious Wang became. One day, when Hu Guohua went out to buy food, Wang or Ganger seized the opportunity to climb over the wall into his house. He searched everywhere, hoping to uncover Hu's secret. Suddenly, he found a large rat sleeping on the bed. Without hesitation, Wang grabbed the rat and threw it into a pot of boiling water on the stove, clamping the lid down tightly. He thought he'd enjoy the show when Hu came back and drank the water. Before Wang could leave, Guohua returned and caught him in the act. When Hu saw his beloved rat dead in the pot, boiled alive, he was furious. He grabbed a kitchen knife and attacked Wang, slashing him a dozen times. Luckily for Wang, who was weak from years of opium addiction, so while Wang was covered in cuts, none were fatal. Bleeding heavily, he fled to the security patrol for help. The leader of the security patrol was a relative of a local warlord who happened to be visiting him at that time. Outraged that such a violent act had occurred in broad daylight, the leader ordered his men to bind Hu Guohua and bring him in immediately. Hu Guohua was brought before the leader, who sternly demanded to know why he had attacked Wang with a knife. With tears streaming down his face, Hu recounted the whole story and ended by saying, "In my darkest days, without this rat, I would not have survived until now. I was careless, and that led to the death of Brother Rat. Though I didn't kill him directly, he died because of me. How can I bear to face the underworld after betraying such a loyal friend? I accept whatever punishment is due for attacking Wang. But please, let me return home first to give my rat a proper burial. Only then can I die in peace." Before the leader could respond, the visiting warlord spoke up in amazement, saying, "Well, I'll be damned. Loyalty and gratitude are the marks of a good man. And if you can be so devoted to a rat, how much more so would you be to a person? I admire your righteousness. Since you have no one to rely on, come join me and serve as my aid. In those turbulent times, military force ruled, and the warlord's words were law. He ordered his men to flog Wang as retribution for Hu, then released Hu to go home and bury his rat. Hu placed the rat's body in a wooden box, dug a grave, and mourned for half a day. Afterward, he joined the warlord as promised. As the saying goes, when you're starving, even chaff tastes sweet. When you're full, even honey loses its flavor. When people are at their lowest, even a bowl of porridge or a piece of bread brings gratitude, let alone the silver that the rat brought to Hu. Of course, the rat's coins were stolen, but as the sages say, it is virtuous to die of thirst rather than drink from a thief's well. Such is the standard of the truly virtuous. But even the ancients struggled with this ideal. How much more, then, for someone like Hu Guohua? All right. Thank you, my listeners. If you like me, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. See you in the next chapter.